Much, Janet, and perhaps Richard. Now you could.
Yeah. Okay. Is this on?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've been. I didn't come with a prepared text because I realized partly that most of the things I wanted to say would be said already. So this is somewhat reactive, and that's fine because I'm quite a reactive person. Temperamentally, I'm quite retributive, I find, or at least this is what my family says. So I just tell you that as a sort of a marker. This comes out particularly when I've been in Africa listening to stories, because what strikes me is what an amazing, unretributive, so many cultures, societies there are so unretributive. I mean, this is a sweeping generalization, but it is so remarkable for me, coming from a different culture, that I thought I would point it out. Not just we want to see X dead or disemboweled or strung up or whatever, but also a lack of personal bitterness, where in place after place I've coming in after a war has ended, and people will say, well, I saw the person who killed my mother. And I said, what did you do? Well, nothing. Why should I do anything? What's the point? And I would say, well, I would have walked across the road and killed them. No, we don't do that sort of thing here. So I'm just putting down a few, and this is all anecdotal, but as I say, the plural of anecdote is data. So I would actually say this is a sweeping generalization, but it is based on a lot of personal experiences covering wars in Africa. And I compare that to the end of the Second World War in France, where the killings went on quite a long time after the war. They don't talk about it much, but even now there are collaborators who were quietly murdered at the end of the war. And in Ireland, the same. You have a legacy of bitterness there. You only have to visit it. And I worked in Ireland quite a long time during that conflict. And then I realize every time England plays football against Germany, we fight the Second World War all over again. And when we play rugby against South Africa, we fight the Boer War all over again. So I think I come from a nation that is defined by war and that rather violent past. So Africa isn't necessarily, its societies don't often define themselves in that way. And I find I'm often amazed that there aren't more wars there. When you just see the state of people's poverty and its politically created deprivation, and the way in which the countries were formed, in which Africans themselves had no part in the creation of those nation states, part, I suppose, in the sense of the new South Africa. But these are countries that were just drawn on maps by people who'd never been there and divided up between Germany and Britain and France and Portugal, and then created as countries with flags and national anthems and handed over in that way in the 1960s. So a lack of national cohesion, a lack of a common sense of identity, even in broken states, there's I was often amazed going to Congo, the way you'd say, well, why don't you secede? Why don't you just get out of this terrible place? This is when it was between Zaire and Congo. And they would say, no, we are Congolese, very proud of it as well. So even a state that I think is the most broken one of all, the people were still wanted to be Congolese, but whether they had the same idea of what that meant if they lived in the east or whether they lived in the north or the south or the west, I don't think they did. And it just dawned on me the other day that Nigeria, another state which I think will be the next really big, badly broken one, it doesn't have it doesn't have a song. Any other country will have this month's song that everybody is singing, everybody is hearing. That doesn't happen in Nigeria. Each area has its own songs, in its own language. So there's no even national identity at a cultural level. So given all of that, I sometimes when audiences are getting a bit sleepy, but I don't think anyone is, I say the problem with Africa, it's not violent enough. But there is such underlying injustice, and people put up with so much for so long that the politics just get worse and worse. And what it needs is some sort of French revolutionary movement to unite its countries, unite under a new nationality. But I might be sounding like the old ANC here. If so, the other thing that struck me was also after the wars. You go to southeast Nigeria and talk about the war, and there's a sense that that Biafra would have been successful, that the Igbo people have been excluded from Nigeria, but there's no deep bitterness. And the way Ojukwu was allowed to continue and is now, I think he ran for president recently, he was the leader of that rebellion, is left alone, I think again is remarkable. And I hear what Janet says about South Africa, but I'm sorry, looked at from the 70s and 80s, could this ever end peacefully? Nobody thought it could. However it changed, it was going to be incredibly violent. And the fact that that violence may have just been delayed and it hasn't really fed through yet, yes, I take the point, but I still call it a miracle. And I think that 4-year constitution building, very few outsiders, where they sat down and arm wrestled across the table over what sort of constitution would create the new South Africa, I think that probably more than the TRC established a basis of a new state. And I think that was really, really quite remarkable. And then you go through all the other ones. Zimbabwe, again, read Mugabe's speech at independence. I mean, just the old ways are over, and for a long time, the whites were not touched at all and were allowed to continue in their old ways and with their old attitudes too, because in the next election they voted again almost unanimously for Ian Smith, the man who'd caused so much suffering. So I just think there, again, a great attempt at reconciliation earlier on. We know it's gone, it's really fallen apart since then. Mozambique, probably I think of 3 really, really, really nasty movements in Africa. There's the RUF in Sierra Leone. There is Renamo in Mozambique, which had no political agenda whatever. It was a South African-backed destabilization force, and of course the Interahamwe in Rwanda. And those ones didn't seem to have any political agenda. But in Mozambique, Renamo they were given cars and houses and suits and ties, and now they're the official opposition, and you can go and meet them. And these are people with a lot of blood on their hands. So that's the way that war ended. Elsewhere, I suppose you could say it ended in defeat. At first in Sierra Leone, it's interesting because there was actually a peace agreement, which then fell apart, and then Foday Sankoh was caught and taken off to prison where he died. But I think there was a sort of defeat. But there you go there, talk to Sierra Leoneans, and again you get this amazing feeling that they can see people in the street who did terrible things, but you don't hear of too many revenge killings. Rwanda, yes, there was a movement that was defeated, but whether there is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is worth its name, I'm not sure. And I think that the jury's out on Rwanda and Liberia. Angola, for example, were a very, very, very long, very nasty war indeed, and that ended simply when the leader of UNITA, the rebel movement, was killed. But all of UNITA, all the other people were brought in. They were given jobs, they were given positions in government, and allowed to be absorbed into the system. So there was no what we would call justice done there at all. And although it's not a model of democracy, there's been no sign of the war coming back again. Burundi, again, a government of national unity has brought that war to an end, rather than international justice. And in Kenya, yes, there seems to be the threat of international justice if they can't do it themselves, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But as I say, most of Africa's wars have actually ended with no victor, no vanquished, even where there's the one side has surrendered, and then seems to be, at least at a political level, some reconciliation in that people are brought into government. It's not ideal, but it doesn't seem to be, and I'm just saying this reflecting on the reality, there doesn't seem to be a great demand for what they might see as our Western retributive justice. What this means in terms of personal justice is, I think, that's problematic, because where individuals do want to pursue it, there doesn't seem to be many mechanisms for doing that. And I suspect that people would be discouraged in places like Sierra Leone of taking personal cases to law. Nick indeed preempted a lot of what I was going to say. But when you talked about Africa's reaction and saying this is Western imperialism, yes, that's just was thrown into the mix. It's the usual abuse you get from African leaders towards the West, and it's an easy card to play. But I think I was chairing a meeting on Sudan about 18 months ago, where there was a very large number of Sudanese there who were very angry about Bashir's arrest warrant, and I noticed that a lot of the other Africans in the room felt the same. So I just sort of said, can we have a quick show of hands on, how many people would support the ICC if it was also pursuing Bush and Blair? And almost the entire room put their hands up. And I think that's what it's the core of it, is that the International Criminal Court it started in Africa. And I asked Ocampo himself about this, and he said, well, yes, because it's obvious. The appalling things that are happening in Africa are so obvious, and these are horrific, so bad that it's an open and shut case, and we needed some early wins, so that's why we went for them. Well, you can see it from his point of view. He wants to succeed quickly in establishing his court and having some cases to try, but for the Africans it looked like we are, only us do bad things, and all the other appalling things in the world are being ignored. And Africa was regarded as his low-hanging fruit. Just on Sudan, I think there was a peace process which required Bashir's authority to be part of and to announce that arrest warrant at that time. It was a huge risk at the very least. He may then have pulled out altogether and gone for broke. In fact, he didn't at first. He seemed to pull back and try and make peaceable noises, build up his own local support base in Sudan, and then try and make some reconciliatory noises. But I'm not sure how this will play out long term. But I just wonder whether the threat of being dragged off to the International Criminal Court would induce him to make peace in Sudan. On local justice, which was another point, and here I was very impressed by the religious and traditional leaders in northern Uganda who wanted an Acholi settlement for the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, and felt that outside interference would not help. There has to be some sort of internal reconciliation within the Acholi people. But of course, that didn't work for all the other people that the LRA attacked. The other people in the region, the Langi, the Teso, and other groups that they had. It obviously wouldn't work for them. This internal local justice. Again, the pursuit, with the knowledge that Kony would be brought to trial. Would that help end the war or not? And I think that was a very, very big issue indeed. And it's possible that had Museveni made him deputy minister of land with a nice car and a nice house in Kampala and a security guard, that might have ended the war. But knowing that that wasn't going to happen, that he would be he was going to have to face some sort of justice, I think was probably the final straw. He'd fought a very successful war, and he probably took the right decision. He's still on the run, somewhere in Central African Republic, I understand, but still using the same techniques, and it'll take quite a big effort to catch him. In the longer term, I hear all this, and I realize a lot of language is shorthand of state failure and capacity building and so on. I think, well, what would this actually mean in these particular countries? And I think probably something much deeper is needed in many of these countries is needed. To come back to where I started, these countries are old societies in the new states, and there's no sense of what they should really be like, and whether that should be what we should concentrate on is trying to find, or I mean, not we, sorry, in that sense, I think only the people there can do it, which is to find new forms of democracy where you have accountability, you have you can hold individuals to account, that everybody has a say, but at the same time, nobody is excluded. So this first-past-the-post, multi-party, winner-takes-all democracy, which tends to divide societies vertically in Africa. The parties become vehicles for often become vehicles for ethnic groups. So dividing the country on an ethnic basis, which seems to be very dangerous. That is somehow overcome, so that after an election there isn't a whole part of the country, a whole group of people who feel we're losers, and we might actually do better if we picked up a gun. So trying to create a new form of democracy. I mean, the trouble is, if everybody's included, then how do you do the accountability bit and a group that's going to criticize the government but still feel part of that nation state? And I think that's what's missing in a lot of democracy in Africa. So I think that a creation of a new democracy in Africa, or new democracies, they're all very, very, very different, and that's acknowledged by outsiders as a valid way forward, because with those rights that Janet was talking about built in as well, so they're individual rights, I think that may be the way forward after these sort of wars, rather than just capacity building and state, the state institutions, which again, when I've seen it, look rather like ours, rather than something that is perhaps more appropriate to the social conditions in Africa.
Thank you very much.